A couple of days ago, Mr. Meeker sent to several of us in the office the findings of a recent poll conducted by the Cato Institute. The Cato Institute is a libertarian, Washington-based think tank, and it was quite fascinating. The survey was titled, "The State of Free Speech and Tolerance in America." It was an extremely long report covering a lot of issues. It was very in-depth. I'm not going to get into the details of it here, but the conclusions of the report tied directly into what I was planning to speak on today, and I thought, well, that'll just make a good introduction. Essentially, the report concluded that our society has some really big issues facing us that we need to sit down and talk about and work through and resolve, but the majority of the people in America are afraid to, because they know that whatever opinion they express will offend somebody else. The survey asked people about divisive issues such as religious freedom, racism, terrorism, immigration, abortion, minority rights, women's issues, freedom of speech, gender, gay, and lesbian issues, foreign policy, political correctness, poverty, crime, the police, the environment, health care, gun control. You know, you start putting them all together in one pot and you realize how inflammatory every one of these issues are. It makes you realize how many big things we have facing us in our nation. And basically it concluded that not only are we hopelessly divided, we are extremely confused. We have trouble even defining what the issues are. It offered as an example the inability of people, whether they are conservative or liberal, to even come to agreement on what some terms mean. For example, the term hate speech. What is hate speech? You get people on both sides of the aisle at all perspectives of the pendulum here arguing over what that is. As a whole, the majority of Americans condemn hate speech as being morally unacceptable. Everybody across the board says, you know, that's not right. But on the other hand, we also say, well, we can't ban it because, well, actually, we argue over we can ban it or not and what you can ban, because some say, well, then you start meddling with what is a basic constitutional right, freedom of speech. And so we end up arguing. This is hate speech. No, it isn't. But that is. No, it isn't. And we are very confused about how to even define our terms. The basic read that I got out of that poll was that we are a highly sensitive society. We're highly sensitive, very opinionated, very polarized in our opinions, highly critical of those who hold opinions on the other side, and very easily offended when somebody says something we don't agree with. That is sort of the state. And the conclusion, again, was that people, as a result, are afraid to really get into in-depth conversation about these things. So instead of bringing issues to the table and having constructive discussion, we are really closing down the opportunity. I don't know about you. I probably know about you, but at least I'll speak for myself. I get so weary of turning on TV, the news, and interviews and seeing people just yelling at each other and talking over the top of each other as they're supposed to be discussing something. But it seems to be that's where we are. We live in the culture of criticism. The culture of criticism. As I heard one person explain it, everybody wants to judge others, but don't you dare judge me. It's sort of the state of mind. Highly sensitive about what is said toward us, highly insensitive about what is said toward others. We seem to be moving more and more toward both easily offending and being easily offended. This is not a new issue because it's a human nature issue. It's always been around. It's one of those, you can't hope to control it, you can only hope to contain it issues. but we are moving as a world toward being less and less able to control it and to contain it. And that's going to have some very destructive consequences for society. So, that said, what about us? What about us, God's people? We are called to be in the world, but not of the world. What level of concern, what level of awareness should we have, not just about the world's condition, but about our own lives, on this issue of offending and being offended? How important is that? I was talking just before services with Carolina Itura, 12 years old. Little girl comes up and says, "So, what are you talking about today?" I said, "Offending." And she said, "Oh, yeah, that happens all the time, doesn't it?" I said, "I even tell people sometimes, I find that offensive." Here's a 12-year-old. And I was sort of joking, and I said, "Well, I am happy to say that I have never done anything or said anything that offended anybody." She rolled her eyes and said, "Yeah, right." She said, "We all offend people." I thought, well, there's a 12-year-old cutting right to the heart of my sermon. It's not real complicated, but it is pretty deep and pretty important, as we will see. Only a fool, I think, would say, "I've never offended anybody," even when it comes to our own brothers and sisters in the church. You know, it wasn't long after being in the ministry that I realized and had a little talk with myself that, Clyde, you are in a people job. And you will be spending all week visiting, counseling God's people, and then spending a good hour of talking with them every week. And the more you talk, the higher risk you run of eventually offending somebody. So you better be careful. But you know what? Giving myself that little talk didn't solve the problem, because I look back on many times in life. Have you ever just blurted something out, and as soon as you felt it coming out of your mouth, you were trying to pull it back in because, you know, oh, I should not have said that. Well, it happens more than once. As James said, we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in word, he's a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. Haven't met that person yet. Proverbs 10:19 says, "In the multitude of words, sin is not lacking." The more we talk, the more we're going to run the risk of offending. There have been times when I felt guilty reading 1 Corinthians 8:13, where Paul said, "If food makes my brother to stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble." Paul was not the kind to say, well, some people just shouldn't be so sensitive. He was not the kind to say, I'm just calling it the way it is. You need to get over it. No, Paul took a Christian approach of saying, I'm going to do everything I can to not offend my brothers. I'll even sacrifice myself not to offend. Matthew 18:7 becomes a huge concern when you think you've offended somebody. Matthew 18, verse 7. This is pretty strong language. Matthew 18:7. "Woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes." Woe to that man by whom the offense comes. We don't want to do this. We don't intend to do it most of the time. But all of us have been the person by whom offenses have come to somebody at one time or the other. Sometimes we know about it and we instantly regret it and we do whatever we can to patch it up. Other times we don't know about it. We go blindly our way, just clueless to the fact that we just steamrolled somebody's feelings. It might have caused them hurt. It's one of the most common things we have to deal with. Offenses must come because we're human. It's a scary feeling to know we've caused offense and we shouldn't do it. But in today's society, it seems like it's becoming more and more difficult to avoid it. Which leads me to the main focus today. I'm not going to be talking about offending people. We're going to look at the other side of the coin, probably the more difficult side of the coin, and examine the question, what about the person who is offended? Not the one who offends, but the one who is offended. The Bible has a lot to say about offending, but it also has a lot to say about being offended. Even those who have a right to be, a good reason to be. Offenses must come. So it's inevitable that sooner or later we will be asking ourselves the question, how then will I handle it? How will I handle it? In verse 6, let's read this. He said, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin. Now that's interesting. That's the New King James. The King James says, whoever causes one of these little ones to be offended. There are some other translations that say, whoever causes one of them to stumble. But regardless of how it's translated, it says it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Wow. Obviously, Christ's words give great pause to thinking about being a cause of offense. But let's take this and dig a little deeper into this issue with some other questions. Was Jesus excusing personal responsibility of the one who stumbles? Now, he was talking about the one who offends, but what about the one who is offended? Was he excusing personal responsibility? Can you go to God and say, I stumbled, but it wasn't my fault. They caused me to. And see, this scripture here says it's their fault, not mine. Well, I don't think you can read that in here. This is talking about the one who causes offense, but what about the one who is offended? Can we blame our sins on somebody else? Well, let me ask, what is a little one? What is a little one? He said, one of these little ones. Who is a little one? What is a little one? You might say, well, a little one, that's somebody who's new in the faith. Okay, that's good. So what do we do with the problem that it's not just new in the faith people who stumble? What about the people who've been in the faith for a long time who stumble? Because they are little ones too, or at least if they go that direction. There have been people long in the faith who have stumbled in the way that we will describe. Is there ever a point where God considers that we should no longer be little? Is there ever a point where God puts a responsibility on us where he would say, yes, I see the situation, and yes, what was said or done was stupid, and it was way out of line, and it could cause a little one to stumble, but I expect more of you. I would expect that you would not stumble over this by now. You've been around long enough to know how to handle these things. Is it possible that God would say, you know, we're no longer supposed to be little. We have to be mature enough to handle these things that come. Could it be that we can be in the church for years and still be little? Little in the ability to withstand wrong treatment. Little in the ability to forgive. Little in understanding the way humans are. Little in humility. Little in the capacity to turn the other cheek. Could it be that someone in the church a long time could remain little in these areas of spiritual maturity, and the time comes when something that could be offensive, that is out of line, could happen, could be said or done, and yet the person could pick up the millstone and put it around their neck and go jump off the dock themselves? Could it be? Could there be a time when someone could be doing something knowingly or unknowingly that would be so offensive that would cause us to stumble And God would say, yes, but I hold you responsible for the way you reacted. Let's mull over these questions while we walk through a few examples that teach us some great lessons about being offended. Because the truth of the matter is, we all have our limits. We all have our soft underbelly. We all have our sensitivities and our touchy spots. And when those things hit, how will we handle it? Let's take a look at what God shows us about being easily offended. But first of all, let's define something. What does it mean to be offended? What does that mean? Does that mean to get mad, angry, get in a huff over something, feelings hurt? Well, that's a reaction, and it can include that, but it's more than that. First of all, let's define it by just looking at the Greek word. I'm going to spell this word for you. The word used in verse 6 for sin. If we cause one of those little ones to sin, or as the other translations have, to be offended or to stumble. And I think you will find quite amazing and fascinating what emerges. The Greek word for sin here is spelled S-K-A-N-D-A-L-I-Z-O. Scandalizo. From which we get our English word scandal. You might think, scandal? What does a scandal have to do with being offended? Mr. Beltran, who is translating this in Spanish, showed me the Spanish Bible that he was using. He showed me this verse just before services. And the Spanish word is escandalizar, very close to the Greek word. Scandal. Well, to get a little bit more in that and understanding, let's go to Vine's Expository Dictionary. And it says scandalizo in Greek originally was the name of the part of the trap in which the bait was attached. You set a trap, there's a part of it where you put the bait. And hence, it came to be called the trap or the snare itself. You'll probably remember before the feast, Mr. Burnett telling you the story about all the rats in his backyard. We've had the same problem in McKinney. Well, he lives in McKinney too. In our neighborhood, I started my rat killing and mouse killing this week. Went down and bought 3 big rat traps. They're all outside, but I'm tired of them getting in the garden and running around at night. And so I told my wife, I said, I'm an old cowboy and I'm going to go out and set my trap lines. Well, I put my traps out. There's that little part where you put the peanut butter. That's the scandalizo. That's the part of the trap. So I set a bunch of scandalizos this week. Vines goes on to say, it's used in Revelation 2:14 as the word stumbling block, where it says Balaam taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel. Balaam's device was to trap Israel. That's what it is. It uses the example in Matthew 16:23. It was a time when Jesus was telling the disciples that he was going to die. You know what happened? Peter rebuked him, and he says, far be it from you, that's not going to happen. What did Jesus say? Jesus said, get behind me, Satan, you are an offense to me, a scandalizo. Jesus was basically saying, this line of thinking is a trap. It's a trap for you, and if I go down that road, I'll be trapped too. It'll cause us to stumble and to be snared. Interesting way of wording it. Thayer's dictionary explains further how it's used in several applications. To put a stumbling block or an impediment in the way upon which another can trip and fall. Forwards, Mr. Burnett. Or backwards. Metaphorically, to offend. To entice to sin. To cause a person to begin to distrust and desert one whom he ought to trust and obey. To cause to fall away. To see in another what I disapprove of and what hinders me from acknowledging his authority. That's what happened to Peter. Peter should have acknowledged Jesus' authority, but instead it offended him. And he said, no, that's not going to happen to you. And he began to rebuke Jesus. It's used in meaning to cause one to judge unfavorably or unjustly of another. Gossip can be a scandalizo. It can be a trap that sucks people in so very easily. That's why the Greek word is translated in English in various ways: sin, offend, stumbling block, snare. And again, we all know that we should not do this, to put an offense like that in front of other people. But let's come back to the angle that I want to focus on today. Can we at times put the stumbling block in front of ourselves? Can we cause ourselves to stumble, set up our own trap by being too sensitive? Too sensitive. And instead of the rat, they are spiritual character issues that give us root. Because when the tribulation or the persecution arises, even if we have the truth, if we don't have the root, if we're not rooted, we can be offended. Other things cause offense. Let's go to, this is a parable here. Let's look at a real life situation. John 6 records a case where the word itself, see in verse 21 of Matthew 13, it says, when tribulation arises because of the word. Well, John 6 talks about a situation of the word straight from Jesus' mouth that caused offense. John 6 is a long chapter where a heavy doctrine is introduced. Jesus talks about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. That was pretty heavy. We come to verse 60. Therefore, many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, "This is a hard saying." This is a hard saying, difficult. Who can understand it? When Jesus knew in himself that his disciples murmured about this, he said to them, "Does this offend you?" Margin says, "Does this make you stumble? Does this offend you?" Well, the answer was, yes, it did. It did offend them. Verse 66, from that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. No more. Well, I thought this was pretty good, but nah, I'm not going to go this way. You ever wondered whatever happened to them? Did they ever find their way back? Or did that experience just put such a wall up that they would never consider? Did they ever get over it? I don't know. That's something they have to deal with between them and God. Matthew 24 is another heavy scripture. Matthew 24, Jesus answering the question, what will be the sign of your coming and of the sign and the end of the age? And he lists a lot of things here, and in verse 10, one of the things he listed was, then many will be offended and will betray one another and hate one another. Now, it certainly happens in society. Will it happen to God's people? Here's a danger. Someone getting offended and betraying. You want to know another danger? The one who is betrayed now getting offended because you betrayed me. That could happen too. What would cause somebody to do that? What would cause somebody to get offended and betrayed? Well, brethren, you stop and think about it. Probably most of us can remember situations, things people have said, what somebody does, what somebody does not do, correction, wrong correction, lack of promotion, jealousy, the way some things are done in the church or not done in the church, outside persecution, like the parable said. I've seen people get offended at God because he did not answer their prayers. We could probably come up with many. Now let's ask, is there a root cause? Is there a root cause of being offended? I believe there is. I believe it can be summarized in one word. One of the basic reasons that we find in common in virtually all examples in the Bible of people being offended is it's an element of being self-focused, and you see it when people get offended and stay offended. You can trace it back in one way or another to pride. Pride is almost always, if not always, at the root. Self-centered, my feelings, my hurt, my way, my view. Something will be there that pride is exhibited in one form or another. Knowing what Christ said, offenses must come, means we have to be really watching the pride factor. The pride factor, because it opens the door for being easily offended. You remember when Jesus went back to his hometown, preached in the synagogue? It's in Matthew 13. You can turn there. What was the reaction? Hey, our local hometown boy made good. Let's get a parade tomorrow. No, their reaction was hardly that. Their reaction, it says in verses 53 through 58, was, where does he think he comes from? Where did he get his mighty works and his wisdom? We know who he is. We know all of his family. He is one of us. Who does he think he is? What drives that? It's nothing else than pride. Nothing else than pride. Verse 57, Matthew 13. Very simple statement. So they were offended at him. They were offended at him. Okay, here's a question. At whose doorstep does the fault lie? We read earlier, Christ said, woe to him by whom offenses come. Was he responsible for their being offended? He was just being perfect was all. He was doing his job. He was doing what God had called him to do, and yet they got offended at him. Here is Jesus, the one who said, don't offend, and people were getting offended at him. But was it his fault, or was it the pride of others being injured due to their sensitivities? Well, there are a lot of examples. It's easy to pick bad examples. We have so far. I read a thing the other day that I thought was really intriguing. It said, do you learn best from bad examples or good examples? I thought, well, that's an interesting question. Do I learn best from seeing bad examples or good examples? We've seen several bad examples. Let's see what we learn from a good example here. This is one, this account is so powerful that, I marvel at it every time I read it. And I also have to say it's deeply moving. I think when you stop and really get into this story, it is just deeply moving. Before we read it, let's set it up, though. Let's take this story and put it into a modern context. Let's say you're sitting here right now, and you're not feeling well. As the service has gone on, you've started feeling worse and worse. Let's say you've even got some chest pain going on. Something is going on in your body, and you aren't well. And after services, you just want to get anointed and go home. You may even think, I may have to go to the hospital. So right after services, you walk up to Mr. Burnett, who is surrounded by several men, and they are talking about the social next month. And you come up there and you just say, excuse me, I am feeling I'm feeling really rotten. I'm feeling really sick. My heart's hurting. Would you anoint me? What if you said that and Mr. Burnett just did this? Just looked at you. Said nothing. Just looked at you. Just stared. What would you do? Well, with that in mind, let's go to Matthew 15. Matthew 15, verse 21. Then Jesus went out from there and departed to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a woman of Canaan came from that region and cried out to him, saying, Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed. But he answered her not a word. Doesn't say a thing. He just looks at her. Why did Christ do this? I have a theory. I'll tell you in a few minutes. But let's go on with our scenario. Here you are. You've asked Mr. Burnett to anoint you. He's just, not only has he not answered or said anything to you, he's just looking at you. But while he's looking at you, one of the other men standing there butts in and says, Why don't you leave him alone? We're talking about the social. And you hear one of the others mutter under their breath something about how rude it is to interrupt. What would you do then? How would you react? What would you do? Well, let's read on. He answered her not a word. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, Send her away. She cries out after us. Oh, this lady is so annoying. She and her daughter. Oh, we've got important things to talk about here. What would you do? Then when the minister does speak, when Mr. Burnett does decide that he'll talk to you, he says basically, I don't have time to fool with you. Verse 24, he answered and said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. You're a Canaanite. You're a Canaanite, you're a woman. I don't do Canaanites. What if Mr. Burnett looked at you and said, I don't have time. Check back with me later. Maybe someday, maybe next week. Hope you get better. What would you do? She came and worshiped him, saying, Lord, help me. Help me. But he answered and said, You know what? It's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to little dogs. There are probably a lot of people today who would say, that is hate speech. It's not good to take little children's bread and throw it to dogs. What would you say to this? What did she say? Verse 27, she said, True, Lord. Yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table. I'm not sure I would have handled it that well. Would you? Why would Jesus do this? Why would he treat her such a way? Well, verse 28, Jesus answered and said to her, O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire. And her daughter was healed from that very hour. Well, here's my theory. I think Christ knew this about her to begin with. He had that ability to discern the thoughts and intents of the heart. I think he knew her faith. He knew her attitude. He knew her lack of pride. He knew her love for her daughter. And so he used this as a teaching opportunity. I mean, this was rare. He didn't treat most people this way, you know. This wasn't his regular way of dealing with people. This was so unusual. He must have discerned this is an unusual situation. I think he knew that she could handle it. And so he took the occasion to teach the disciples and all of us a lesson. Maybe he was quiet when she first came. Maybe he was quiet just to see what would the disciples do. How would they react to her? Well, guess what? They were offended. They were offended. This woman, this Gentile, well, has the gall to come and do this. How dare she? What a stark attitude. Her attitude compared to theirs. Now, they were disciples. This was part of their training. They were learning to follow. Now, from all appearances, this lady had what we would call a right to be offended, right? Well, if anybody has a right to get upset, I look at this and say, I don't know if I would handle it this well or not. She might have had the right to get offended, but what would she have gained? What would she have gained if she would have gotten offended? If she had gotten offended, how do you think she would have reacted? There is one thing I think she could have gained by being offended. She could have gained her pride. She could have gained her pride. She could have trotted off back to Cana and told everybody, you know that Jesus fellow everybody is so impressed with? You ought to hear how he talked to me. I don't take that off anybody. No, sir. Nobody's going to talk to me that way. And I told him off. You should have heard what I said to him. Nobody's going to deal with me that way. Oh, she could have had all sorts of things to try to put him in his place, and she could have told her story with pride. The only problem is her daughter would still be demon-possessed, wouldn't she? Her daughter would have still been demon-possessed. Sort of makes you ask the question, how important is our pride? How important is it? Pride was amazingly unimportant to this lady. It was amazingly unimportant to her. She did not stumble at several things that could have made a lot of other people stumble. She didn't stumble. Quite the opposite was true with the Pharisees. What makes this woman's story all the more striking is that it came right on the heels of another occasion where people got offended at Jesus earlier in the chapter. Let's go to verse 1, chapter 15. Then the scribes and the Pharisees came to Jesus saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders?" Now, what were they in a huff over? What were they offended at? Let's go on. They're not washing their hands right. They are offensive. They're not washing their hands the right way. The tradition of the elders. And your disciples are doing this. Oh, they were very upset. And Jesus took it right back to them, and he launched into what is a fairly famous section here, and he had plenty to say. Unlike to the woman, when he had nothing to say, he jumped on this, and he calls them hypocrites. He deals very strongly with it. Now, you have the Pharisees and you have Christ, but you also have the disciples who are watching all this, and they are wide-eyed. And in verse 12, they came to Jesus, verse 12, and they said, "Don't you know the Pharisees were offended when they heard this?" I said, "Jesus, that wasn't politically correct, That was not, they were offended at what you said. They were very concerned that the Pharisees were offended." They never said that about the Canaanite woman. They never said, "Jesus, don't you know this woman was offended?" No, they weren't. Like us, they just had a lot to learn about spiritual understanding. And once again, the one who said, "Woe to him by whom offenses come," the one who tells us not to offend, he offended people. So you have to ask, whose fault was it? Whose fault was it? Romans 9:33 even says he is the rock of offense for people who are offended over such things. It just exemplifies the lesson I'm trying to bring out, that sometimes being offended is the human's fault. The one who gets offended, it's their fault. It was not his fault that they were offended. It was not his fault. Sometimes God lays the responsibility of dealing with the offense properly at our doorstep. Why did he offend the Pharisees? Because he was calling for them to change their ways. He was confronting them with truth. What was the problem? Pride. Pride. They thought they knew better, and that is a form of pride. They didn't think they needed to change. That's a form of pride. When confronted then with the truth, they got mad. They got offended. It's a human reaction. It's a human condition of pride. God has called us to change. He calls on every human to change. He wants us to be different from the world. And one of the ways he wants us to be different is in this matter of living in a society that gets quickly offended, to be able to have a spiritual outlook on life that rises to a higher level of understanding, a higher level of reacting. The mind of Christ was such that when he suffered truly offensive things coming at him, how did he handle it? 1 Peter 2, verses 22 through 24 says, no guile was found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously, and he himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness. We are to live the way he lived. No guile in his mouth. When reviled, and boy, being reviled is very offensive, but it means we have the self-control not to revile in return. When suffering, what do people humanly do? They threaten, they bounce back, they react. That's not the way God handles things. We commit ourselves to him who judges righteously. Humility, not pride, was the hallmark of the character of Jesus Christ. He was the strongest person who ever lived, and he was humble. He endured all through his life, but especially at the end. He endured the most offensive behavior that anybody could suffer. And at the greatest height of the greatest offense possible, being put to death in all innocence because of what other people had done, he was able to say, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. He was a living example of Matthew 24:10 that we read earlier. Many will be offended and will betray one another. His was the ultimate betrayal. People were offended at him being caught in the trap. We catch our own fingers in the trap. There are examples in the Bible of people doing just that. We're going to look at a few, but let's ask one more question. One more question we've not asked yet, and that is, could I ever get offended at Christ? Could I ever get offended at Christ or God the Father? Now, like you, I'd like to say no, never. But before we answer, let's put ourselves in the place of some of our peers. Let's go to Matthew 26. Matthew 26, it's recounting the Passover. Jesus' death is just a few hours away, and this was a very critical point in the lives of everybody there. Now, what if Christ decided to manifest himself physically in our midst at the next Passover next spring? Wouldn't that be something? That'd be an unheard of opportunity. But what if he came and kept the Passover with us, and then when it was all over, he looked around and he said, before this work is finished, you are all going to be offended at something and forsake me. What if he said that to us? What would our reaction be? Well, in verse 31, Jesus said to them, all of you will be made to stumble. The margin in the King James says, will be caused to take offense at me. Because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. What did they think when they heard that? What did they think could happen that would cause that? Because that's not where they were at that moment, not in their thinking. Can you anticipate anything that would cause you to stumble in following God? It's ironic. It didn't take long for it to happen. Actually, it offended Peter that Christ made the statement. That's how long it took. Peter answered, verse 33, and said to him, even though all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. What you just said, that's not right. That's not me. And Jesus said, well, let me tell you something. Before the rooster crows 3 times, you will deny me 3 times. Or before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to him, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And he said that, and it trapped the rest of the disciples. So said all the disciples. That line of reasoning laid a trap. Now, nobody wants to think of themselves as denying Christ. But Christ told them, hey, it's going to happen tonight. And it obviously offended Peter that he would say that. You know the rest of the story. It can happen. It did happen. Did they get mad at Jesus? No. They just didn't believe him. They resisted what he had to say. And a few hours go by, and when they are accused by bystanders of associating with Jesus, they stumbled. They stumbled. Their desire to be approved by Jesus competed with their desire to be approved by people. And which one lost? So they stumbled over this test that came their way, and they did something that they didn't think they would do. They stumbled. It can happen. Matthew 11. We'll be mostly in the book of Matthew. Matthew 11. Here's another really interesting story. Matthew 11, verse 1. It came to pass when Jesus finished commanding his 12 disciples that he departed from there to teach and preach in their cities. And when John heard in prison about the works of Christ. Okay, let's stop there. What did he hear? What did he hear? Who did he hear it from? What was the slant to the story of what he heard? Was it accurate? Was it prejudiced? What had he heard? Why do I ask those questions? Because what we're going to read, John himself had a most surprising question, especially when you consider that earlier he said, I am preparing the way of the Lord. And having known that, it makes you wonder, why did he ask this question? He sent, verse 2, he sent 2 of his disciples. When he'd heard about the works of the Lord of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to him, are you the coming one, or do we look for another? Wow. John all of a sudden had some doubts based on what he had heard. Oh, I was hearing some things about you. Now I've got questions. Are you the one? Do we start looking for another? John doubted. Now, verse 11, Christ says, among those born of women, there has not risen one greater than John the Baptist. But this just shows us something. It shows us that we are human. And there's a vast gap between human and God. And even the greatest humans can be susceptible to being trapped. To being trapped. John doubted. Have you ever doubted? Have you ever had people put doubts, questions in your minds about other people, about the ways of God? Any number of things. Let's go on. Jesus answered and said to them, "Go and tell John the things which you hear and see." Now, when you read Luke's version, Luke 7:21, it said, at that very hour, Jesus did many miracles. He healed a lot of people. He did a lot of things right then at that very hour. And then he told them, "You go and tell John the things which you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, the poor have the gospel preached to them." I don't know what you've been hearing, John, from other sources, but you go and tell him what you see with your own eyes. And then, verse 6, "And blessed is he who is not offended because of me." Blessed is he who is not offended because of me. What was it that John could have heard that could have caused him to start doubting and to be offended potentially? I don't know exactly, but I do know that verse 18 and 19 says, John came neither eating or drinking, and he was accused of having a demon. Christ came eating and drinking, and they said he was a glutton and a wine-bibber. Were those some of the rumors that were getting back to John? Look, John, he doesn't do things the way you do it. Whatever it was, John started questioning. And Christ said, don't get offended. Don't get offended. We are all subject to jumping to conclusions, not getting the facts, not searching out the whole matter. These are just a couple of examples, the disciples and John. But you look at history. You can look at history, ancient and modern, the history of God's people, and you can see a trail of offended people. Moses offended Miriam and Aaron, and he was innocent. But they concocted something to get offended over. The Israelites were offended over Samuel's sons. And in that case, they were offensive. They were doing some horribly offensive things. But because the children of Israel got so offended and got themselves and their own reasoning in the middle of things, they took a course that was also offensive to God. They reacted in a terrible way. There were people who got offended over David's actions. If you want to look at the big picture, Satan got offended at God. Satan got offended at God. And in our time, we've seen people be offended left and right because of all sorts of things. Now, here's the interesting thing. In every situation where you see people getting offended, there were other people observing the same situation who did not get offended. So what's the difference? What's the difference? Oftentimes, it's because people have positioned themselves mentally, emotionally, and spiritually to be easily offended. They go by their feelings more than facts. They're not careful. And when offenses do come, they stumble. Other things can cause offense. Let's go to Matthew 13. In Matthew 13, we have a parable, the parable of the sower. And one of the lessons in this parable of the sower has to do with people getting offended. Matthew 13, verse 20. But he who received the seed on stony places, this is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Oh, this is great. Boy, that Life Open Truth, they have answers to my questions. I'm excited. I read all this. And then they come to something that is harder. That's a test. Yet, verse 21, he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he stumbles. Scandalizo. Immediately he stumbles. He's offended. They may have the word doctrinally that is correct, but they have to have more. They have to have a root. They have to be rooted. The root here is a type of character. It's a spiritual character that exists. It has to do with being committed to God, committed to our brother, confidence in God, faith, trust, the willingness to suffer loss, humility, the attitude of forgiveness. All these things that are not doctrinal explanations and betrayed him. And yet he did not get offended in return. Can we practice that level of followership, as we heard in the sermonette? Offenses must come, Jesus said. And it's our option. It's our option when they come. We can get offended. We can stay offended. We can stumble over anything we want to. But before we do, we should ask ourselves, what is it worth? What is it worth it? Is it worth letting this go? Because it'll hold us back spiritually. Being offended, staying offended, kills a forgiving spirit. It prevents the development of proper love toward others. It can even kill our relationship with God if we're not careful. Proverbs 18:19 says, "A brother offended is harder to win than a strong city." A brother offended is harder to win for a strong city, because if we're offended, we won't be the same. We won't notice the other person's repentance. They may repent. We won't see it. We won't see their growth. It makes us less forgiving. If we get offended at the church, it won't be the same. We can reject the body. If we get offended at God, it won't be the same. It'll affect our faith, our commitment. So, the reality of life is offensive things will come. We have to deal with it. Sometimes we go home and we sulk for a while and we lick our wounds. We have to deal with it, though. We have to heal up. The record of humanity is that people get offended over just about anything possible. And we're living in a society that sometimes a survey like I read to you or told you about, it reveals how there's changes going on. It seems like our society is almost conditioning people to be more and more offensive and more easily offended. That's the world we live in. It's part of Satan's work. In that world, we are to be learning to love as God loves, to think as God thinks. That one word, love, is tied directly to the subject of offense. Let's conclude with the summary statement in the Bible on this subject. Psalm 119. Psalm 119. Great scripture, easily memorized, really good to have in your toolbox spiritually, to pull this out, to be able to pull it out and use it when we need it. Psalm 119, verse 165. Great peace have those who love your law, and nothing causes them to stumble. As the King James Version says, nothing shall offend them. Nothing causes them to stumble. Why? Well, it's because God's law is opposite to anything that will lead to the wrong kind of handling offenses. It sees offensive things. It can suffer from offensive things. You can even hurt for a long time. You can be scarred by the offenses of some, but without stumbling. Without stumbling. Without developing the wrong approach to our fellow man, and most of all, the wrong approach toward God. Love, great peace of those who love your law. That love of God's law is outgoing, it's giving, it's love toward God, it's love toward man. It is not self-centered. It's a mind of concern for others. It is not focused on pride at all. It's just not there. Thus, the love of God's law, because it is that way, it avoids stumbling, and thus it has peace. We can have the peace of God in a world that is troubled, in a world that's going to make it more difficult. We can have the peace of God through the love of the law of God and following Jesus Christ's example.